The old school bus rattled and clunked its way up the winding mountain road. Inside, the air crackled with excited energy. 20 pairs of eyes sparkled with anticipation. 20 voices bounced off the worn vinyl seats in a symphony of laughter and playful arguments. Sarah, her nose pressed against the window, watched the familiar landscape transform. The cozy houses and tidy shops of their small town gave way to towering pines, their branches heavy with a dusting of early morning mist. The higher they climbed, the cooler the air, chasing away the last remnants of a sleepy summer morning. "We're almost there." Emily, her best friend, bounced in her seat, her pigtails bobbing like metronomes. Sarah grinned, mirroring her excitement. A day exploring the old nature trails, learning about the plants, and maybe even spotting a deer. It was the perfect escape from stuffy classrooms and multiplication tables. Their teacher, Mrs. Wilson, clapped her hands, momentarily silencing the chatter. "Remember, everyone, stick together, no wandering off." Her voice held a familiar touch of exasperation, but her warm smile softened it. Today was about more than just lessons. It was about making memories. Outside, the scenery blurred with the bus's steady climb. Green melded into gray as the mist thickened, obscuring the distant peaks. For a moment, the sun seemed to struggle against the encroaching gloom, casting long, ominous shadows across the road. Up ahead, a figure emerged from the swirling mist. Someone stood in the middle of the road, forcing their driver to slow down. A hitchhiker, maybe? Sarah strained her eyes, trying to make out their features through the rain-spattered window. There was something odd about the way the figure stood. Too still, too hunched. A shiver rippled through her, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The playful chatter inside the bus faded, replaced by curious murmurs. The figure ahead seemed to solidify, the mist clinging to it like a shroud. And as the bus grew closer, a wave of unease washed over Sarah. This was no lost traveler. This was something far less welcoming. The figure in the road shifted, a jerky, unnatural motion that sent a fresh wave of chills down Sarah's spine. The bus came to a groaning halt a few yards short of it, the engine grumbling into silence. Mrs. Wilson stood, her brow furrowed. "Stay in your seats, everyone," she instructed, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a note of unease. "I'll go check if they need assistance." As their teacher stepped off the bus, the children pressed closer to the windows. The mist seemed to curl and writhe around the figure, revealing glimpses of tattered clothing, and an unsettling stillness that had nothing to do with the lack of wind. Suddenly, Emily gasped. "Look," she cried, pointing a trembling finger out the window. At first, Sarah saw nothing unusual. Then her eyes followed her friend's gaze, focusing on a patch of wet asphalt just beyond the figure in the road. There, in a smear of crimson against the grey, was a child's brightly colored backpack. Abandoned. A collective gasp rippled through the bus. Fear, raw and primal, surged through Sarah, replacing the innocent excitement of moments earlier. Whatever stood in the road wasn't a stranded traveler. It was something far more dangerous. Mrs. Wilson's voice, usually so comforting, was now a thin, panicked cry. "Get back! Go!" And then the bus windows exploded inward, showering the children with shards of glass and an icy blast of mist. From the swirling chaos emerged a monstrous silhouette. Claws, obsidian black and impossibly long, swiped through the air, slashing through metal and flesh with equal ease. Sarah screamed, a sound lost in a chorus of terror. The bus, their sanctuary moments before, was now a cage ripped open by an unimaginable horror. The air filled with the metallic tang of blood, a guttural roar, the snapping of bones. And then, through eyes wide with terror, she glimpsed crimson, 2 pinpricks of malevolent light burning through the swirling mist. The world dissolved into a horrifying kaleidoscope of screams, shattered glass, and the stench of blood. Sarah scrambled back, blindly pushing against the seats, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic bird. A monstrous hand, black and glistening, tore through the metal roof above her, spraying a shower of sparks. It grasped the boy in the seat ahead, his face a mask of terror as he was yanked into the swirling mist. His scream, cut short in mid-air, echoed in Sarah's ears long after the sound itself had faded. Panic choked her, a desperate need to escape, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Across the aisle, Emily's face was pale as a ghost, her normally vibrant eyes wide and vacant. A single tear rolled down her cheek, a silent testament to the horror they were witnessing. Mrs. Wilson, their beloved teacher, lay crumpled by the doorway, a crimson stain blooming on her chest. The sight ripped a fresh wave of terror from Sarah's throat, a strangled cry that died in her constricted lungs. Another monstrous limb slammed into the side of the bus, ripping a gaping hole into the metal. Claws, wickedly sharp and dripping with a viscous liquid, snatched at children, their desperate pleas lost in the cacophony of terror. One by one, her classmates disappeared into the churning mist, devoured by the unseen horror. Sarah felt a hand clamp over her mouth, stifling her scream. It was Michael, the shy boy who usually sat alone in the back. His eyes, wide and glassy, held a single message: "Be quiet." They huddled together on the floor, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. The unearthly growls, the sickening sounds of tearing flesh, continued for what felt like an eternity. Each passing moment chipped away at Sarah's sanity, leaving behind a raw, primal fear. Then, as suddenly as it began, the carnage stopped. An unnatural silence descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the ragged gasps of those who remained. Sarah peeked out from behind her seat, her breath catching in her throat. The creature loomed over the wreckage of the bus, its form a grotesque silhouette against the swirling mist. It turned its head, crimson eyes locking onto Sarah's, burning through the gloom with an intelligence that sent chills down her spine. In that horrifying moment, Sarah knew she wasn't just looking at a monster. She was looking at a predator who savored its prey's fear before the kill. The creature let out a bone-chilling roar, the sound echoing through the mountains, and then, with unnatural speed, it plunged towards the wreckage of the bus. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and screamed, expecting the agony of monstrous claws tearing into her flesh. But instead, she felt an icy blast of mist wash over her, and then a sickening lurch. The bus tipped sideways, throwing her across the aisle. Rough hands, was it the creature, or was it just another terrified child? Clawed at her, dragging her towards the gaping hole in the side of the bus. The mist engulfed her, a suffocating shroud that clung to her skin and burned her eyes. Blinded, disoriented, she fought back with desperation, kicking and punching against unseen hands. Then came another surge of movement, her stomach lurching sickeningly with every twist and lurch. A monstrous bellow filled her ears, and then nothing. Just a rushing, roaring sound that seemed to go on forever. Finally, she felt rough ground beneath her, the cold shock of wet leaves against her cheek. She gasped, choking on the mist-laden air, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Someone whimpered beside her. "Sarah?" It was Emily's voice, cracked and barely above a whisper. Sarah struggled to sit up, fear and nausea clawing at her. The mist was thinner here, swirling tendrils reaching skyward like desperate fingers. Through the swirling grey, she glimpsed the ravaged form of the school bus tipped on its side, a broken, empty shell. And then she saw them. Crimson eyes blazed through the fog, their malevolent stare fixated upon her and Emily. The monstrous form began to move, its strides long and fluid as it closed the distance between them. A clawed hand shot out of the mist, the jagged nails glinting dully. It snatched Emily, her scream echoing through the silence of the woods. Sarah lunged forward, grabbing her friend's arm, but the strength of the creature was overwhelming. With a sickening ripping sound, Emily was torn from Sarah's grasp and disappeared into the unforgiving mist. Sarah recoiled in horror. A strangled sob tore from her throat as she realized her best friend was gone. But before she could even process the enormity of her loss, another clawed hand closed around her arm. She was yanked off her feet, her scream dying in her throat as the creature dragged her back into the swirling mist. The mountain road, usually a symbol of escape and adventure, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. Ambulances lined the shoulder, their flashing lights casting grotesque shadows on the wreckage of the school bus. Officers moved with grim determination, marking out the area, collecting evidence that offered little comfort. Nearby, groups of children huddled together. Those lucky enough to escape with minor injuries were wrapped in shock blankets, their eyes wide and vacant, unable to process the destruction surrounding them. A lone child sat by the roadside, rocking back and forth, repeating, "Mommy, Mommy," in a monotone that pierced the air. Parents, faces etched with agony, clung to scraps of hope. They thrust photos at harried investigators, their voices pleading and desperate. "Have you seen my son? Blonde hair, blue eyes." The growing crowd was a mix of frantic families, news crews jostling for space, and grim-faced law enforcement from nearby towns called in for assistance. The sheer scale of the tragedy had drawn them all, but none was prepared for the horror that awaited them. A veteran paramedic collapsed against a tree, his shoulders heaving with sobs. A young officer turned away, her hand pressed against her mouth as she fought back nausea. Even seasoned professionals struggled to comprehend the cruelty displayed on that mountainside. Across the chaotic scene, the grim work continued. Bodies were removed from the bus, carefully covered to shelter their mutilated forms from the curious eyes of the media and grieving families. And then, like a ripple spreading through a pond, the word began to circulate. The sheriff's daughter. She was on the bus. They took her. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, and then a collective gasp of despair. Amongst the chaos, a single figure stood in stark contrast. The deputy who had made the initial discoveries stood by his cruiser, his radio pressed to his ear. As he spoke, his voice trembled, betraying the seasoned officer's fear. "Sheriff, you need to get down here, sir. It's bad," he choked out, his gaze dotting nervously towards the woods. "It ain't like nothing I've ever seen. And Sarah, she ain't among the—" He couldn't bring himself to say it. The deputy lowered the radio, his hand shaking. The world around him seemed to blur. He was dimly aware of the activity, the cries of anguish, the flashing lights. But a single truth echoed in his mind, a chilling certainty that transcended the immediate horror. Whatever had done this, it wasn't finished.